let's start with introducing you to the pineal gland and two important neurotransmitters, serotonin and melatonin. Let's start with the word pineal or pineal. Both pronunciations are correct. Pineal or pineal meaning pine cone shape. The pineal gland, it looks just like a pine cone. There's no coincidence that it's called pine cone shaped. Now the pineal gland is a tiny little gland, a little bigger than the size of a grain of rice. It's right between the back of your throat and the back of your head. And it's important to know exactly where it is, because when we begin to practice activating the pineal gland, you're going to have to become aware of where it exists and put your attention on it. And where you place your attention is where you place your energy. And the more you pay attention to it, the more you become aware of it, the more you stay present with it, the more you begin to put energy to begin to activate it. Pineal gland is very sensitive to visible light. Light that's coming from the sun, or light that's coming from lights that we have in our homes or in our offices. That wavelength of light. Once light is perceived when our eyes are open, the frequency of light is picked up by the optic nerve, and it sends a signal right to a nucleus in the brain called the suprachiasmic nucleus. That nucleus signals the sympathetic nervous system, which signals the pineal gland, and the pineal gland gets busy making a neurotransmitter called serotonin. And serotonin is the daytime neurotransmitter that, once activated, begins to cause us to become aware that we're local in space and time, and we become conscious that we're our bodies in an environment and in time. And it produces a certain brainwave frequency called beta brainwave frequencies. It is beta brainwaves that causes us to put most of our attention on the outer world. Now, the release of serotonin then gets us up and gets us busy during the day. This graphic represents that small frequency of visible light that exists in the entire electromagnetic spectrum, and is that tiny little sliver of all of reality that our eyes and our senses are the most sensitive to. When there's an inhibition of light, or there's a lack of light, the lack of the wavelength of light that usually hits the back of the eye, the optic nerve, begins to diminish the release of serotonin in the brain. And so the inhibition of light signals the same nucleus in the brain called the suprachiasmic nucleus, which then dampens down the sympathetic nervous system, and now the pineal gland begins to make a chemical called melatonin. And melatonin is the nighttime neurotransmitter. And as melatonin levels begin to rise because of darkness in the evening, then all of a sudden we begin to slow our brain waves down into alpha and theta and ultimately delta. And it's melatonin then that allows our body to restore and regenerate. So serotonin gets us up in the morning, and melatonin puts us to bed at night. And those are two important neurotransmitters that function in a rhythm called the circadian rhythm. And when you live in a certain environment, in a certain place in the world, and as the sun comes up and the sun goes down, your brain chemistry becomes entrained to light.
Well, we have a body in our mind mapped in the brain, and we have a mind in our body. And Descartes kind of separated the two, but there's never a time where the body isn't influencing the mind, and there's never a time where the mind isn't influencing the body. In fact, they're one and the same. So the majority of people's thoughts are connected to certain feelings that influence very specific hormonal centers in the body. For example, if you think an angry thought, you are going to release certain chemicals that activate your adrenal system. You're going to begin to activate survival systems. If you feel suffering, or if you feel pain, or you feel guilty, you produce a different biochemical reaction, produces different hormonal centers to be activated. So most people's thoughts and feelings are taking most of the energy of those thoughts and storing them in the first three energy centers of the body. People call them chakras, but the first three centers are centers of survival. With procreation, consumption, and fight or flight is how most people have survived the majority of their lives. In other words, in survival, it's not a good time to open your heart. So very little people actually make the effort to open their heart. And most of their thoughts and feelings are activating these lower centers. So the majority of the body's energy is stored in these first three centers. So then 95% of that energy stored in the body has to be liberated and driven back to the brain. So we do this breath as a way to pull the mind out of the body or ascend the energy. And yogis would probably love this breath because they have a lot of conscious control over the intrinsic muscles of their body. So the breath is about contracting those intrinsic muscles, the muscles of the perineum, the front and back muscles we use for elimination, the muscles of our lower abdomen or upper abdomen. When we inhale through our nose and we squeeze these muscles, what we're doing is we're pulling that energy from those lower centers up into the brain. Now, when you inhale, normally when we're just hanging out and breathing, when you inhale, the sutures of your skull slightly open up. And your bone, the base of your spine, called your sacrum, that upside down triangle, actually flexes back. So when you inhale and those sutures open up and your sacrum flexes back, the spinal fluid drains. When you exhale, the sacrum flexes forward and those sutures close and it pushes the fluid up. And so inhaling and exhaling begins to propagate a wave. Now, cerebrospinal fluid is made of proteins and salts in solution. And proteins and salts in solution have a charge. When you drop them in solution, they have a negative or positive charge. So now when you begin to inhale and you begin to pull that cerebrospinal fluid up towards your brain and you accelerate those charged molecules, according to physics, when you accelerate a charged molecule, you create an invisible field called an inductance field. So now there's information going from your brain to your body and from your body to the brain all the time. But when you do this breath and you start accelerating those charged molecules, you create this inductance field moving in a certain direction, and all of a sudden, all that energy from those lower centers start moving up to the brain.
One of the most common questions that we get amongst our community, especially beginning students, is how do I do the breath? And before I answer how do I do the breath, let's talk about why you do the breath and what are the reasons for doing it. So the purpose of the breath is to pull the mind out of the body, to take all of the energy that exists in our first three centers, the energy that we use to create a life, or that sexual energy, all the energy that we use to digest the meal, all the energy that we use to overcome some threat or challenge in our environment, all that energy that's resting in our first three centers, and draw that energy back up into the brain. Now, think about this. Most people's consciousness, most people's energy, most people's thoughts and feelings are continuously sending energy in the form of thought. Now remember, every thought has a frequency, every thought has an energy, every thought is carried on an energy, information is carried on a frequency, that every thought you think is producing an energetic field. So most people's thoughts are connected to their first three centers, and the first three centers are the centers of survival. So whether you're thinking thoughts about your sexual identity or sexual fantasies, whether you're thinking thoughts that have to do with pain and suffering, guilt and shame and unworthiness, whether you've been thinking thoughts of anger, aggression, judgment, fear, hatred, anger, frustration, those thoughts produce certain chemicals in the brain called neuropeptides. Those chemicals then begin to signal different hormonal centers, and those centers fill with energy. Just like when you have a sexual thought, all of a sudden, if you're having a sexual fantasy, certain neuropeptides are released to signal your first center, and all of a sudden you get energy moving into that center. And now, once energy's in that center, you're emitting information out from that center into the field. So, but if people are thinking certain thoughts, whether it's sexual thoughts or thoughts that are related to suffering or pain or guilt or shame, or thoughts that are related to frustration or anger or aggression, those thoughts then produce certain chemicals that begin to signal certain hormonal centers for you to feel a certain way. Once you feel that feeling, and now you're feeling angry or suffering or sexual or whatever, the very feeling that you're feeling is going to influence more of the same thoughts, which will produce the same chemicals. And all of a sudden, people get caught in these loops that become their state of being. In other words, they're taking thought in the form of an emotion and storing it as energy in these first three centers. So the majority of our energy is sitting in our first three centers and very little in the centers that are above the first three centers. So then the repetition of this cycle over time is conditioning the body to become the mind of that emotion. So we have all this creative energy stored in our first three centers, and 95% of who we are becomes a set of subconscious emotional reactions, behaviors, habits, hardwired programs in which the body has been conditioned to become the mind.